Week 3 then, God's jealousy for his own glory. Let me begin with a couple of very potent quotes. This inspired the subtitle for this video series, God's exclusive demands on his renegade bride. God demands that his people recognize his exclusive claims upon them. God's jealousy for his own glory is his inherent jealousy that desires that his glory be acknowledged and proclaimed. When God is jealous, it means that he continually seeks to protect his own honor. It is not only the motion that leads to divine wrath, it is also the cause of God's loving pursuit of his rebellious people when they go astray. So this is really the purest, most fundamental theology that really I think we could talk about for a few minutes. That the glory of God is the ultimate reason for the existence of the universe. The primary means by which this is expressed is the faithfulness of his people. So the ultimate reason, the ultimate purpose is the glory of God in all things. And that the primary expression of that is the faithfulness of his covenant people. So when you have an unfaithful bride and unfaithful people, what happens? God is dishonored. And that's why we're talking first, before we come to godly human jealousy, we have to understand God's jealousy first for his own glory. The church lacks jealousy. That's an important aspect of this that reflects a lack of understanding of the centrality of marriage as the central reality that relates to his glory. Think of marriage and the reality of marriage being synonymous, one and the same thing of the glory of God. Marriage ultimately is the doing of God for the display of God, John Piper says. Parable of permanence, the greatest, most beautiful picture that we've been given for the display of God. Think about it in those terms, that God ultimately does it. He ultimately does it to display himself. This is why Ephesians 5 in the New Testament makes it abundantly clear that a man and a woman, a husband and a wife now, is just pointing to something more transcendent and eternal. Christ and his bride becoming not one flesh, but one spirit. And we'll see that at the end of the course. We are examining God's jealousy in order to form a foundation from which to understand godly human jealousy in the coming weeks. And we must start, therefore, with his precious name. There are two kinds of jealousy. Number one, jealousy for his own glory that we're focusing on now. That's the ultimate reason, as I've said. And secondly, jealousy for the faithfulness of his people, the primary means or the primary expression of that. Listen to this. God's jealous demand that he be supremely valued is a theme woven throughout salvation history, from the creation of the world, which declares his glory, and of man and woman who bear his image, to the final judgment and the eternal heavenly praise he will receive. God's self-exalting goal can be clearly seen. This goal in no way detracts from his covenant love, which is also a central motive in his relationship with his people. In other words, God is most glorified when he is most enjoyed. That God is most glorified in his bride when they are most satisfied in him, to coin the famous John Piper phrase. But it is absolutely true and absolutely essential to understand. The church and parachurch missions thereof are not jealous for the glory of God in the way that they should be when they reduce everything to a let's agree to disagree ecumenical soup of nonsense. It is displaying the lack of jealousy for the glory of God. The ecumenical world that makes up 85%, the Lausanne Agreement, the so-called Lausanne Covenant makes up 85% of missions activity in South America, or it's a large percentage globally that adopt this attitude of having unity within diversity, diversity within unity. And what it is manifestly not is jealous for the glory of God. It does not understand God. It gives token reference and notion, token gestures to the glory of God, but it's not animated to the point of being able to say, no, this is not true. How can that be true and that be true? And I'm jealous for my God. That's what a church who are jealous for the glory of God sound like. Thinking of the knowledge of God, true knowledge of God, and how that relates to his name, the name of God. The name of God is a window into his character. Remember in Exodus 34, where God says, I am the Lord whose name is jealous. See, his name is a window, is this infinitely, eternally important window into his nature, into his character. His name reveals who he is and how he acts, and it refers to the total complex of God's identity and reputation. John Oswald said that his name reveals who he is and how he acts, and it refers to the total complex of God's identity and reputation. Isn't that wonderful? So think of God's name and God's glory as two ways of expressing the same thing. I'd like to give you now just two quick examples of passages in which the emphasis is on God's seeking and preserving and protecting and proclaiming his own glory, his jealousy for that. Firstly, in Exodus 10, verses 1 to 2, I'll just read these verses to you. Then the Lord said to Moses, go into Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants, that I may show these signs of mine among them, and that you may tell in the hearing of your son and of your grandson how I have dealt harshly with the Egyptians, and what signs I have done among them, that you may know that I am the Lord. That's his name, isn't it? The Lord, whose name is jealous. Being proclaimed, God's purposes with Pharaoh and with Egypt were so that you may know that I am the Lord. See that? That's God's jealousy for his own glory. Similarly, in Isaiah 48, let's just flick over to Isaiah 48. And verses 9 and 11, this is perhaps one of the most famous passages to make this point, rarer as they are, and I'll explain that in just a minute. Verses 9 and 11 of Isaiah 48. For my name's sake, I defer my anger. For the sake of my praise, I restrain it for you, that I may not cut you off. For my own sake I do it. For how should my name be profaned? My glory, we should all know. My glory I will not give to another. Those last two passages are very well known scriptures that highlight and underline and emphasize that God is jealous for his own glory. And therefore the question is, what happens when God's glory is violated? How does God respond to that? He responds in jealousy to maintain his holiness, because his name and his character and his reputation are closely linked. It's really important to see and understand this in this week's session. Indeed, that when God's glory is violated, it's his name and character and reputation that's being violated. You see, divine jealousy is located at the location between the holiness, anger, and love of God. This is why when we want to have some positive anthropomorphisms, but not the negative, we don't actually know God. We don't know what he's like. That divine jealousy is located, the exact location is where divine jealousy encounters divine holiness and love. But when we don't want the jealousy, do we actually have the love and the holiness? I would like to just explain something that's quite difficult. So listen carefully, lean in and try and bear with me. You might need to listen to this a couple of times. In terms of responding appropriately to this God of glory, who is jealous for his own glory. Because the theology of the Bible unfolds within human history, God's character is usually revealed in the context of his relationship with humanity. So, as would be expected within this salvation history, the majority of divine jealousy passages have God's people as the focus. Unlike the two passages that I've just read, that's not the case. But they're rarer passages. There are fewer of them. But that doesn't mean to say that God isn't jealous for his own glory when it's being expressed without that direct self-reference, if that makes sense. Stay with me. Although God's self-directed jealousy is foundational for all other types of godly jealousy, passages where God's own honour is emphasised are not as common. This causes gaps in the progressive development of this kind of jealousy through the Old Testament canon. This does not make God's jealousy for his own glory any less significant or foundational. It merely points to the historical nature of God's revelation of himself. So in other words, the example that I gave before when Moses came down from Sinai at the golden calf abhorrence and he smashed the tablets and he acted in jealousy, that was a form of godly human jealousy, but it was also God's jealousy for his own glory. When we read the Bible and we aren't aware of that, we aren't aware of the true nature of God. We're not actually aware of the genuine prevalence and emphasis of God's jealousy for his own glory if we don't understand that it's present when he's not referring directly to himself, like in Isaiah 48, as I've just read. This has been the heartache and the grief for me and for Mary and for others of you I know regarding the lack of response to the events of 2020, the opportunity that it was to respond faithfully to this glory that we're talking about of his name, jealousy of God for his own name, his own glory. Two words that I want to just mention in passing, that I mentioned, kabod and doxa. C.S. Lewis wrote about kabod in his famous essay, The Weight of Glory, and the root idea of heaviness, like Lewis mentions in The Weight of Glory, his famous essay. Both are often rendered honour. So when we read in the word of the honour, for the sake of his name is another way of putting it. What we're talking about and thinking about ultimately and responding to or not is his glory, is his worth. And so when you think of a lack of response in the church since 2020 particularly, but please let's not make this about the last 4 years. This is about the last 4 centuries plus. This sense of kabod being to do with the weight of God, a bit like Ezekiel sat at the river that will come to, and he's just overwhelmed. He just has this sense of heaviness. The heavy hand of the Lord was upon him. It's like Jeremiah and that sense of fire in his bones or the heat. It's because these men were consumed and animated for the glory of God, for the sake of his name. Remember what we just read in Isaiah 48. For the sake of my name, I will do it. When man accurately recognizes and appropriately responds to this revealed character of God in worship, obedience and service, he gives glory to God. So when the bride of Christ responds faithfully to God's nature and character like that, it is worship, isn't it? It's glorifying God. But the opposite is also true. When the response is the same old, stiff-necked, calloused, hard-hearted, unrepentant, unyielding, it has the opposite effect of glorifying God. And that's why the likes of Jeremiah had fire in his bones. That's why the likes of Ezekiel sat with the heavy hand of the Lord upon him in an overwhelmed state. If we are not groaning, this is why they were in those conditions, because they were animated and responding appropriately themselves to the glory and name and honour of God, but also in the context in which the vast majority of people, of God's people, were not. This is the love of most growing cold, Matthew 24:12. This is why I'm doing this teaching, in the hope that it will at least prepare some of you to not be swept away into lukewarmness, that your love for him will not grow cold, that you would rather become animated like Ezekiel and Jeremiah for the glory of his name, the glory of his honor, jealous for the glory of God. When God demands that he be recognized as the one and only true God and worshipped and obeyed as such, he is jealously demanding the glory due to him. So when idolatry, which is always spiritual adultery and whoredom, when idolatry is prevalent, particularly in ways that people don't even recognize or understand, God doesn't stop demanding exclusive faithfulness to him, the glory that's due to his name, does he? He doesn't stop. Because he has tethered himself, associated his own name, reputation and glory with the covenant people of God, he will not allow that to be the end result. He will redeem his bride, and that is the ultimate purpose. The knowledge of God produces a healthy, holy fear of him and is the correct response to God. False knowledge of God produces what we have in the church today, hence the urgent need for divine jealousy. Amazingly, God has made it so that his glory and honor are inextricably woven into the process of the preparation of the church for the end of the age. Isn't that amazing? And we see the picture of the virgins in Matthew 25 prepared with oil in their lamps. This is what that's featuring. That's what that's showcasing. The jealousy of God expressed through the faithfulness of his people preparing the church for the return of Christ. Jealousy and the church prepared. Next week, we're going to look at God's jealousy for the faithfulness of his people in the Old Testament.